That cold morning, no one expected a confession to change everything. What started as a simple question became a story the whole family tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we share the confessions people only dare to say in front of God, and the quiet choices that save a soul. The rain had just started, a soft patter against the stained glass windows of the old chapel when she walked in. Evelyn, that's what they called her in town, Mrs. Hargrove to most, the widow who kept her garden immaculate even after her husband passed. But that morning, she wasn't the composed woman who baked pies for church suppers. Her coat was damp, clinging to her shoulders, and her eyes, usually sharp with quiet pride, were red-rimmed, as if she'd been holding back a flood for days. I was in the vestry, sorting through hymnals, when the door creaked open. "Pastor Ellis, that's me. I've heard confessions that shook the foundations of lives, but nothing prepared me for the weight she carried. She didn't kneel at the altar or sit in the front pew. Instead, she stood in the aisle, her hands twisting the strap of her purse, the leather worn smooth from years of faithful attendance. The air smelled of polished wood and faint incense, the kind that lingers after Sunday service, but today it felt heavier, like the chapel itself was holding its breath. "Evelyn," I said, setting the books aside and stepping toward her, "what brings you here so early?" She looked up, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words landed like a thunderclap. "He's seeing other women, Pastor. My son Daniel, right there in the open, while Sarah's wasting away in that hospital bed." I froze, the hymnals forgotten. Sarah, Daniel's wife of 15 years, the one who'd been fighting cancer for months now, her body frail under the weight of treatments that promised hope but delivered only exhaustion. The town knew her as the gentle soul who organized the children's choir, always with a smile that hid her pain. And Daniel, the successful architect who'd built half the new homes on Elm Street, the golden boy everyone envied. How could this be? "Sit down, Evelyn," I urged, guiding her to a pew. The wood was cool against her palms as she gripped it, her knuckles whitening. Outside, the rain picked up, drumming insistently on the roof, mirroring the storm in her eyes. She didn't cry. Not yet. It was as if the tears had been dammed up too long, threatening to break the levee. "Tell me," I said softly, taking a seat beside her, close enough to offer presence but not intrusion. In moments like these, words are secondary. It's the silence that invites truth. She drew a shaky breath, the chapel's dim light casting shadows across her face, etching lines of worry deeper than I'd noticed before. "It started small, Pastor. Whispers at first from the nurses at the hospital. Sarah's been in and out for weeks. Chemo, then the fevers. Now they're talking palliative care. She's so weak she can barely hold a cup of tea, but she still asks for him every time I visit. Where's Daniel? Is he coming today? And I lie, Pastor. I say he's at work, tied up with a big project. Because what else can I tell her?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if to trap the sob. The rain outside blurred the world beyond the windows, turning the grey sky into a watery veil. I nodded, letting the quiet stretch, knowing that confessions like this need room to unfold. "Go on," I prompted gently, my own heart tightening. I'd counseled Daniel and Sarah at their wedding, watched their family grow with 2 young boys who now waited at home for a mother who might not return. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the crucifix above the altar, the carved figure gazing down with eternal patience. Last night I saw it with my own eyes. I was driving home from the hospital. Sarah had fallen asleep, and the doctor said she might rest through the night. I passed that little diner on Route 12, the one with the neon sign that flickers at dusk. Daniel's truck was parked out front, his work boots caked in mud from the site. I thought, maybe he's grabbing coffee, unwinding after a long day. But then I saw them through the window, him and that woman from his office, the young one with the red hair. They were laughing past her, her hand on his arm, leaning in like they shared a secret the world wasn't privy to. She paused, her breath hitching, the purse slipping to the floor with a soft thud. The chapel's clock ticked steadily in the background, marking time that felt merciless. He didn't even look guilty, just comfortable. Like Sarah's suffering was a distant inconvenience, something he could set aside for an hour or two. And the boys, Tommy and little Ben, they're with me most nights now, asking why Daddy's always late. I can't keep covering for him. It's eating me alive. I leaned forward slightly, the weight of her words settling between us like an unspoken prayer. Evelyn, this is a heavy burden. How long have you known? Weeks, she admitted, her voice gaining a fragile strength. A friend mentioned seeing him out with someone at the county fair last month. I didn't believe it at first. Daniel's always been the devoted one, the son who called every Sunday, who built that extension on our house when my arthritis flared up. But then the calls stopped. The visits to Sarah dwindled to quick check-ins, excuses about deadlines, and now this. Openness. It's like he's daring the world to notice, or maybe just stopped caring who does. The rain eased to a drizzle, light filtering through in pale shafts that danced across the floor. Evelyn's hands trembled as she retrieved her purse, but she didn't stand, not yet. I came here because I don't know what to do. Confront him? Tell Sarah? She's fighting so hard, Pastor, holding on for those boys, for him. If she knew. Her words trailed off, the silence returning, thick and profound. In that moment the chapel felt smaller, the walls closing in with the gravity of betrayal. I'd seen marriages fracture under less, but this, infidelity blooming in the shadow of death, was a wound that cut to the soul. Evelyn's confession hung in the air, a raw thread waiting to unravel the life she'd known. And as the morning light crept in, I knew this was only the beginning of a story that would test faith, loyalty, and the quiet strength it takes to face the truth. Evelyn shifted on the pew, the wood creaking faintly under her weight, as if the chapel itself were settling into the story she was about to unfold. The rain had softened to a steady murmur outside, blurring the edges of the world beyond, leaving only the two of us in this cocoon of polished oak and shadowed light. I could see the lines etched around her eyes, the kind that come from years of quiet vigilance, watching over a family that had once felt like a blessing, but now weighed like a chain. Daniel and Sarah, she began, her voice steadying as she traced the familiar path of memory. They met right after college. He was building his first big project, a row of townhouses on the edge of town, and she was teaching third grade at the elementary school, the one with the playground that overlooks the river. Sarah had this way about her, Pastor, soft-spoken but with a fire underneath. She saw something in Daniel, the ambition, the drive to make a name for himself. They married young, in the spring, under a tent in our backyard. I remember the way she looked at him like he was the anchor she'd been waiting for. I nodded, keeping my expression open, a silent invitation for her to continue. Confessions like this often started with the glow of beginnings, the illusions that masked the fractures waiting to form. Evelyn's fingers smoothed the damp fabric of her coat, as if ironing out the past. They were good together at first. Daniel worked long hours, but he'd come home with sketches of houses he'd designed just for her, dream homes with wraparound porches and sunlit kitchens. Sarah quit teaching after Tommy came along, then Ben 2 years later. She poured herself into the home, the boys, the church bake sales, and Daniel. He climbed. That firm he started, Hargrove Designs, it put us on the map. Houses for the mayor, the bank president. Money flowed in, enough for the big colonial on Maple Lane, with a pool out back that the boys splashed in all summer. A faint smile touched her lips, fleeting, like sunlight breaking through clouds. But it faded as her gaze dropped to her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "My husband, God rest him, passed 5 years ago, heart attack, sudden as a storm." Daniel stepped up then. He and Sarah insisted I move closer into the little guest house on their property. "Mom, you're family," he said. "We take care of our own." It made sense. My arthritis made the old place hard to manage. Stairs everywhere, the garden too much to tend alone. They handled the mortgage on it, paid the utilities. I helped with the boys after school, cooked dinners when Sarah was tired. It felt like a partnership, not a handout. The clock on the wall ticked onward, each second a reminder of time slipping away, much like the life Sarah was losing in that sterile hospital room miles away. I leaned back slightly, giving her space, but my mind turned to the undercurrent she was skirting, the dependencies that bind tighter than love. But things shifted after the diagnosis. Evelyn continued, her tone dropping, the words measured as if tasting their bitterness. "Sarah found the lump last winter during a routine check. Breast cancer, aggressive. The doctors were optimistic at first. Surgery, chemo, radiation. Daniel was there every step, holding her hand through the nausea, driving her to appointments. The boys, they were scared but resilient. Tommy, at 12, started drawing pictures of superheroes beating villains, and Ben clung to his stuffed bear like a lifeline. I moved into the main house more often, sleeping on the couch to be near if Sarah needed anything in the night." She paused, her breath catching, and I could almost feel the chill of those endless nights, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen masking muffled sobs. Daniel threw himself into work. "I need to keep things steady," he'd say. "Bills don't pay themselves." The firm was booming, new contracts, expansions into the city. Money was tight with the medical costs piling up, even with insurance. Sarah's treatments ate through their savings, experimental drugs, home care nurses. I dipped into my widow's pension to help, small amounts at first, then more. Daniel noticed, of course. "Mom, you're a saint," he'd say, clapping me on the shoulder, but there was this edge to it, like gratitude mixed with expectation. The light from the windows shifted, casting a pale glow across her face, highlighting the weariness that had settled in her bones. Outside, a car splashed through a puddle on the wet street, a distant reminder of lives moving forward while hers unraveled. "Then the fevers started," she said, her voice threading with quiet ache. "Sarah couldn't keep anything down. Lost so much weight, her wedding ring slipped off her finger. The boys stopped asking about her coming home. They knew in that way children do. Daniel." He began staying late at the office. "Meetings," he'd explain, coming in with the scent of coffee and something floral clinging to his shirt. Sarah noticed even in her haze. "Is everything okay with work?" she'd whisper to me during my visits, her hand cool and fragile in mine. I'd nod, change the subject to the boys' school projects, anything to spare her more pain. Evelyn's eyes met mine then, raw with the confession of complicity. I saw the signs. Pastor, but I pushed them down. Daniel was grieving in his way, stressed, overwhelmed. He was still paying for my guest house, covering the repairs when the roof leaked last fall. I told myself it was the pressure, that he'd snap back once Sarah turned the corner. But the late nights turned to overnights at the site, excuses about deadlines that stretched into weekends. The woman from the office, Laura, I think her name is, she started showing up at family events, just a colleague helping with paperwork. Sarah smiled through it, too weak to question, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, the unspoken hurt. I placed a hand lightly on the pew between us, not touching, just anchoring the moment. "It sounds like you were holding the family together, Evelyn. But at what cost to you?" She swallowed, the motion visible in the dim light. "Everything. I'd lie awake in that guest house, listening to the wind rattle the windows, wondering if I was enabling him. My savings dwindled, Groceries for the boys, gas to the hospital, even little gifts to keep their spirits up. Daniel knew. He'd slip me cash sometimes, but it came with a look, like I owed him my silence. "Family sticks together, Mum. No need to air dirty laundry." And Sarah. She endured it all with that quiet grace, praying by her bedside, whispering about the life they'd build after. But Daniel drifted further, his laughter echoing from bars downtown while she faded. The rain picked up again, a rhythmic patter that underscored the erosion she'd described, the slow seep of neglect into the foundations of trust. Evelyn's shoulders slumped, the weight of years pressing down, revealing how dependency had woven itself into exploitation, dignity chipped away one unspoken compromise at a time. In the chapel's hush, her story laid bare the fragility of bonds, the way love could twist into something that demanded endurance at the expense of truth. The chapel's air grew thicker as Evelyn's words hung between us, the rain outside now a persistent whisper against the panes, like secrets too heavy to keep inside. She rubbed her hands together, the friction a small rebellion against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I could see her gathering the threads of the story, moving from the private fractures to the public gaze that had begun to distort everything. "It wasn't just in our home that things started to twist, Pastor," she said, her voice gaining a quiet edge, as if naming the judgments aloud made them sharper. "The town." They saw what they wanted to see. Daniel was the pillar, the man holding it all together while his wife fought her battle. At church coffee hour after Sarah's diagnosis, folks would clap him on the back. "You're a rock, Dan. How do you do it?" He'd nod, humble as ever, mention the long hours at the firm, the boys needing stability. No one asked about the empty chair beside him in the pews or why Sarah's hospital visit stretched without him there. I listened. The crucifix above us a silent witness, its carved eyes seeming to soften in the diffused light. Evelyn's confession was peeling back layers, revealing not just betrayal, but the isolation it bred, how the community's admiration blinded them to the shadows. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, the damp coat forgotten on the pew. "My sister, Clara, she lives across the county line, visits once a month, started in early on. I'd call her after a rough night, voice shaking as I mentioned Daniel's absences. 'He's out again, Clara. Says it's work, but I saw that woman's car in the driveway once, early morning.' She'd sigh, that patient tone she used for everything, like I was the one stirring trouble. 'Evelyn, you're imagining things. Daniel's under so much pressure. Sarah's illness, the bills. Men cope differently. Don't be dramatic. You'll only make it worse for the boys.' Dramatic. As if pointing out the obvious was some flight of fancy from an old woman with too much time on her hands. The clock ticked on, indifferent, while outside a gust rattled the doors, sending a shiver through the space. I nodded slowly, prompting without words, knowing how these misreadings could erode resolve, like water on stone. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the floor, tracing the worn patterns in the carpet, memories surfacing in the quiet. Then there was the family reunion last summer, before Sarah got really bad. We gathered at Aunt May's farm, picnic tables under the oaks, potato salad and laughter to pretend life was normal. Daniel brought Laura along, introduced her as a colleague from the office, helping with the big project. She was all smiles, passing plates, chatting about designs like she belonged. I pulled him aside by the barn, whispered, "What are you doing?" "Sarah's home, resting, waiting for you." He laughed it off. "Mom, relax, it's just networking. You're too sensitive these days." "The worry's getting to you." Too sensitive, like my heart was the problem, not his wandering eyes. She paused, a faint tremor in her hands as she clasped them tighter. The chapel felt intimate then, The world narrowed to her unfolding pain, the rain a veil that kept judgments at bay for now. The neighbours chimed in too. Mrs. Wilkins from next door, she's the one who organises the block watch, saw me driving to the hospital alone one evening, stopped me in the yard with her watering can, eyes full of pity. "Evelyn, dear, you look exhausted. Daniel's doing his best, you know. Working himself to the bone for that family. Don't burden him with every little thing. He's got enough." As if my concerns were burdens, not cries for the truth. And when I mentioned the late nights to old Mr. Hargrove, Daniel's uncle at the hardware store, he chuckled, patted my arm. "Widows get confused sometimes, Evie. Arthritis in the joints, fog in the head. Daniel's loyal, always has been. You're ungrateful for all he's done, paying for your place, keeping you close. Ungrateful for speaking up about a son, parading his indiscretions while his wife withered." I shifted slightly, the pew creaking under me, a subtle anchor in the rising tide of her isolation. These were the barbs that cut deepest, I knew, the ones from those who should have seen clearest, turning the victim's quiet endurance into suspicion. Evelyn's voice softened, laced with the ache of repeated dismissals. Even at the hospital, the nurses, good women, overworked, they'd whisper when I lingered too long in the waiting room. "Mrs. Hargrove, Sarah's stable now. Go home. Your son's got it handled. You're hovering like she's a child. Hovering, as if my presence was intrusion, not love. And Sarah. Oh, Pastor, she heard it too in her weaker moments. Her sister visited once, from out of state. Took one look at the monitors and Daniel's empty chair. "Sis, you're holding on so tight, but maybe ease up. Daniel needs space. You're not crazy for thinking he's distant, but pushing him won't help. The cancer's the enemy, not him. Crazy. They called her crazy for sensing the drift, for enduring with eyes wide open to the neglect." The light outside had dimmed further, the afternoon greying into evening, casting long shadows across the altar. Evelyn straightened a fraction, her posture a small reclaiming of space amid the misreadings that had piled on like unspoken accusations. The whole town painted me as the meddlesome mother-in-law, the one too old and confused to see Daniel's sacrifices. "He's building an empire for them," they'd say at the grocery, nodding toward the tabloids with stories of successful men weathering storms. Evelyn's just bitter, living off his goodwill. No one saw the checks I wrote from my pension to cover Sarah's co-pays, the nights I soothed the boy's fears while he chased distractions. Society looks at the shining surface, the house, the firm, the family man, and misses the rot underneath. They misread us all. Sarah as the fragile invalid clinging too desperately, me as the ungrateful shadow in her wake. But it was their blindness that kept the silence alive, letting the betrayal bloom unchecked. She fell quiet then, the weight of those judgments settling like dust in the still air. The rain had eased to a drip, each drop a punctuation to the isolation she'd endured, the way the world had rewritten her loyalty as flaw. In that hush, the chapel held us, a sanctuary from the misreadings that had amplified her pain, turning whispers of truth into echoes of doubt. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel. The chapel's shadows lengthened as the afternoon light waned, the rain's remnants leaving a damp hush that amplified every small sound. The creak of the pew as Evelyn shifted, the distant hum of a car on the wet road outside. Pastor Ellis sat beside her, his posture steady, hands folded loosely in his lap, the faint scent of his wool sweater mingling with the lingering incense. He had listened without interruption through the unraveling of her family's facade, the misjudgments that had isolated her further, but now, in this pocket of quiet, he leaned in slightly, his voice a low anchor amid the storm she'd described. "Evelyn," he began, his words measured like stones placed carefully in a riverbed to steady the flow. "What you've shared. It's a profound betrayal, not just of Sarah, but of the vows that bind a family. Daniel's actions, seeking comfort elsewhere while his wife endures this trial, it's a form of abandonment, dressed up as necessity. You've been carrying this alone, shielding others from the pain, but silence like that can become its own cage. She nodded faintly, her eyes fixed on a sliver of fading light piercing the stained glass, where a dove's silhouette seemed etched in crimson and blue. The weight in her chest eased a fraction, not lifted, but acknowledged, as if his naming it aloud had given it shape, rather than letting it fester in vagueness. The pastor's presence was no thunderous judgment. It was the calm clarity of a man who had walked beside countless souls through their darkest hours, offering not salvation's flash, but the steady light of moral ground. He paused, letting the words settle, the clock's tick marking the space between breaths. This isn't about dramatic confrontations or unraveling everything at once. It's about boundaries, Evelyn. Quiet lines drawn in the sand to protect what's sacred. Your dignity, Sarah's peace. The boy's sense of a world that still holds truth. Daniel's manipulation. It's subtle, isn't it? The way he leans on your silence, your financial help, your role as the family's keeper of secrets. He frames it as loyalty, as sticking together, but it's control, pulling you deeper into complicity while he drifts free. Evelyn's fingers tightened on the edge of the pew, the wood smooth and cool under her palms, grounding her as the pastor's insight pierced the fog she'd wandered in. Manipulation. She'd felt it in the offhand comments about her overreacting, the casual reliance on her pension checks without a full accounting, the expectation that she'd manage the home front so he could chase distractions. But hearing it named in this sacred hush stripped away the guilt she'd wrapped around it like a shroud. "You're right," she murmured, her voice threading through the dim air, barely rising above the soft drip of water from the eaves outside. "He calls it family duty, but it's him deciding what I see, what I say. I pay for the groceries, the boys' clothes, even slipped money for Sarah's pain meds when insurance lagged. And in return, his late nights become my lies to cover. It's like I'm financing his freedom from the very pain he's causing." Pastor Ellis nodded, his expression unchanging, a quiet mirror reflecting her truth without embellishment. The chapel's air felt warmer now, the earlier chill receding as the conversation turned inward toward the core of her endurance. Exactly. And that dependency, your home on their land, the shared finances, it's twisted into leverage. But dignity isn't something you trade for a roof or a son's approval. It's the truth you hold on to even when it trembles. Start by reclaiming your voice, Evelyn, not in anger, but in clarity. Speak to Daniel alone in a moment of calm. Tell him what you've seen, what it costs you. Not to accuse, but to state the boundary. This stops, or I step back from the enabling. She drew a slow breath, the inhale filling the space between them, her shoulders easing as if the words had loosened an invisible knot. Outside, the sky had cleared to a muted grey, the first hints of dusk painting the windows in softer hues. The pastor's counsel was practical, woven with the threads of faith, but rooted in the real. No promises of divine intervention, just the moral courage to name what was wrong. "And protection," he continued gently, his tone even, like a hand extended in the dark. "Document it, quietly. Keep records of the money you've given, the checks, the transfers, notes on what they were for. Not for a fight, but for your own clarity. Should things escalate, if Sarah asks, or the boys later, you'll have the truth in black and white. Consider your living situation too. Look into options for independence, a small apartment in town perhaps, with your pension stretched further but free of obligation. It's not abandonment, it's self-respect. And for Sarah, shield her heart as long as you can, but prepare to be honest if the moment comes. Truth, even painful, honors her more than deception. Evelyn's gaze lifted to meet his, the red-rimmed eyes now holding a spark of resolve, faint but real, like embers stirred after a long night. The chapel enveloped them, its walls a testament to confessions that had led to quiet turnings before. Marriages mended or ended, families redefined not by spectacle, but by the steady choice of integrity. What if he denies it, turns it back on me, says I'm the one breaking the family? Then you stand firm, Pastor Ellis replied, his voice unwavering, the lines around his eyes deepening with empathy. Manipulation thrives on doubt, on making you question your own eyes. But God sees clearly, Evelyn, and so must you. Your endurance has kept this family afloat, but compassion doesn't mean self-destruction. Boundaries are an act of love, for yourself, for Sarah, for the boys who need to see what loyalty truly looks like. Pray on it tonight. Let the silence guide you. You're not alone in this. She sat back, the pew support a small comfort as the weight shifted from crushing to carryable. The pastor rose slowly, offering a hand not to pull her up, but to steady if she chose. In that gesture the council lingered, naming the shadows, drawing the lines, emphasizing the dignity that no betrayal could fully erase. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving only the clean scent of wet earth drifting through a cracked window, a promise of ground reclaimed. Evelyn felt the first stirrings of a boundary forming, not a wall, but a threshold toward truth, as the chapel's peace wrapped around the moral clarity they'd forged together. The evening light filtered through the lace curtains of the guest-house kitchen, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that Evelyn had scrubbed clean just that morning. She stood at the sink, her hands immersed in soapy water, staring at the checkbook open on the counter beside her. The numbers blurred slightly, not from tears, but from the clarity that had taken root in the chapel hours earlier, Pastor Ellis's words echoing like a quiet bell. Boundaries as dignity, truth as the first step out of the cage. Outside, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth after the rain. The main house just visible through the window, its windows glowing warmly against the encroaching dusk. Daniel's truck wasn't in the drive yet. He was late again, as predictable as the ache in her joints. She dried her hands on a faded dish towel, the fabric soft from years of use, and picked up the phone. Her fingers hesitated over the buttons, the weight of habit pressing down, the monthly transfer to the joint account, $500 from her pension, earmarked for household expenses. It had started innocently enough after her husband's death, a way to contribute, to feel useful in the family web. But now, with Sarah's hospital bills mounting and Daniel's distractions parading in plain sight, it felt like pouring water into a sieve, funding the very neglect that hollowed her out. The pastor's counsel replayed in her mind. Document it, reclaim your voice, protect what's sacred. Not in rage, but in quiet resolve. With a steadying breath, Evelyn dialed the bank's automated line, the tinny voice greeting her like an old acquaintance. She entered her account number, the PIN that had been the same since her wedding day, and navigated the menu to the recurring transfers. Her heart thudded softly, not with fear exactly, but with the gravity of crossing a line she'd towed for months. Cancel transfer, she whispered to the empty kitchen, selecting the option as if speaking it aloud made it real. The confirmation beeped back at her, impersonal and final. The $500 staying in her account for the first time in years. It wasn't much in the grand scheme, a fraction of the medical debts, but it was hers, unyielded, a small dam against the flow of enabling. She hung up the phone, its click echoing in the quiet, and sank into the wooden chair by the table. The boys' drawings were pinned to the fridge, Tommy's sketch of a family picnic, Ben's wobbly letters spelling "Get well, Mom," innocent anchors in the storm. Evelyn traced the edge of the checkbook with her finger, the leather cover worn smooth, and felt the shift inside her, subtle as the first leaf turning in autumn. No more financing the facade, the lies she told Sarah to keep the peace, the silence that let Daniel's betrayals flourish. "I won't finance my own humiliation anymore," she murmured to the empty room, the words tasting like resolve, bitter but freeing. It wasn't a declaration to the world, just a vow to herself, born in the chapel's hush and sealed here, in the heart of her diminished world. The front door of the main house banged open then, pulling her from the reverie. Through the window, she saw Daniel stride in, his work boots leaving faint mud prints on the porch, Laura's car idling at the curb before pulling away with a low hum. Evelyn's stomach tightened, but she didn't look away this time. Instead, she rose, smoothing her apron, and stepped out into the cooling air. The path between the houses was gravel, crunching under her sensible shoes, the distance short but feeling endless tonight. The main house loomed, its colonial facade a testament to Daniel's success, but to her it was a place of half-truths, where Sarah's absence echoed from the upstairs bedroom she'd left months ago for the hospital. Daniel was in the kitchen when she entered through the side door, the one that led straight to the mudroom, his back to her, as he poured a glass of water from the filter pitcher. The boys were upstairs, their voices muffled through the floorboards. Tommy reading to Ben, a bedtime ritual Sarah had started. The room smelled of take-out Chinese, containers scattered on the counter, evidence of another meal without her cooking. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, surprise flickering across his face, quickly masked by that easy smile he wore like a shield. "Mom, you're still up? Everything okay with Sarah? I was just heading to call the hospital." Evelyn stood in the doorway, her hands clasped at her waist, the cool evening breeze slipping in behind her. She met his eyes, steady now, the pastor's words fortifying her like an unseen hand on her shoulder. "I visited her this afternoon. She's resting, asks for you still." The lie slipped out one last time. Habitual, but she pushed forward, her voice even, stripped of accusation. "Daniel, we need to talk about the money." He set the glass down, brow furrowing in that practiced way, the one that feigned concern while deflecting. "Money? What's wrong?" "The firm's check bounced last week. Tight month with the new nurse for Sarah. You know how it is." She nodded, stepping closer to the counter, her gaze tracing the clutter without flinching. "I do. That's why I've been sending what I can from my pension. But it stops now. No more transfers. I cancelled the one scheduled for tomorrow." The words landed softly, but the air thickened, Daniel's posture stiffening as he leaned against the sink. "What? Mom, come on. We need that. The boys' school fees, the mortgage. It's all connected. Your family. This is how we get through." Evelyn held his stare, the kitchen light harsh overhead, illuminating the lines of strain around his eyes, the faint stubble from another late night. "Connected, yes, but not at the cost of my silence. I've seen you with her, Daniel. Laura at the diner, the fair, while Sarah fights for every breath. I won't fund that anymore. Not the lies. Not the life you're building away from her." He straightened, color rising in his cheeks, but she saw the flicker of unease, the crack in the facade. "You're overreacting. It's nothing. Stress relief. Sarah wouldn't understand, but you should. After Dad died, you leaned on me. This is the same." "No," she said quietly, the boundary firm now, etched in the space between them. "It's not. I leaned. But I didn't betray. The boys need a father who shows up, not excuses, and I need to stand on my own without trading my dignity for a place to stay." She turned then, not in flight, but purpose, pausing at the door. Think on it. For them. For her. Upstairs, the boys' voices quieted, the house settling into night. Evelyn walked back to the guest house, the gravel steady underfoot, her steps lighter despite the ache in her chest. The small act, the cancelled transfer, the naming of the truth, had cracked open something inside her, a moral awakening that no sermon could impart. It wasn't vengeance. It was the first breath of self-respect, the refusal to be complicit in her own erasure. As she locked her door behind her, the main house's lights flickered on in the living room. Daniel's silhouette pacing alone. The turn had begun, quiet and irreversible, in the hush of a kitchen that had witnessed too many silences. The days following Evelyn's quiet stand blurred into a tense haze, the guest house feeling smaller with each passing hour, its walls pressing in like unspoken accusations. She woke to the sound of gravel crunching under tires the morning after the confrontation, Daniel's truck idling at the end of the path before roaring off to work. No words, no knock on her door, just the engine's growl fading into the distance, leaving her with the echo of her own resolve and a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The boys waved from the kitchen window of the main house, their faces pale against the morning light, Tommy's backpack slung over one shoulder as if nothing had shifted. But everything had. The air between the houses carried a new chill, sharper than the autumn wind rustling the leaves. By midday, the first ripples of retaliation lapped at her edges. The phone rang as she sat at her small kitchen table, sipping weak tea from a chipped mug. The steam curling like unanswered questions. It was Clara, her sister, voice tight on the line, the connection crackling faintly as if distance amplified the judgment. "Evelyn, what on earth have you done? Daniel called last night, sounded wrecked. Says you're cutting him off, money, support, everything, accusing him of things with that woman from work. You know how fragile Sarah is right now. This could push her over the edge." Evelyn gripped the receiver, the plastic cool against her palm, the guest house's clock ticking steadily on the wall behind her. Outside, a squirrel chattered in the oak tree, oblivious to the fracture widening. "Clara, I only spoke the truth. He's been seeing her openly while Sarah—" "Truth!" Clara interrupted, her tone sharpening, laced with that familiar pity. "Or your imagination running wild again? Daniel's exhausted, Evie, holding down the firm, the boys, the hospital runs. He says you've been forgetful lately, mixing up dates, dwelling on rumors. Maybe the stress is getting to you too. Don't make this about you. You'll tear the family apart." The call ended with a click, leaving Evelyn staring at the dial tone. The humiliation settling like damp fog. Forgetful. It was the first thread of the smear. Daniel's words twisted through family channels to paint her as the unreliable one, the meddlesome widow whose mind wandered in grief. She set the phone down, her hands trembling slightly, and pulled out the notebook she'd started at Pastor Ellis's suggestion. Simple lined pages where she jotted dates. Amounts of past transfers, notes on Daniel's late nights, documentation, he'd called it, a quiet shield against the gaslighting. But as she wrote, the entries blurred with the sting of betrayal, her own sister complicit in the deflection. The escalation built through the afternoon, subtle at first, then insistent. A knock came at noon. Mrs. Wilkins from next door, bearing a casserole dish wrapped in foil, her face a mask of neighborly concern under the wide brim of her hat. The sun slanted through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the porch as Evelyn opened the door, the scent of baked chicken wafting in like an unwelcome intrusion. "Heard there was some fuss last night," Mrs. Wilkins said, thrusting the dish forward. "Daniel mentioned you're not feeling well, under the weather perhaps. We all worry about you out here alone. If you need someone to check in, just say." Evelyn took the dish, its warmth seeping through the foil, but the words chilled her. Daniel had been talking, spinning her boundary as instability, a cry for attention from an aging mother too confused to manage her own life. "I'm fine. Thank you," she replied evenly, the door half closed already, "just handling family matters." But as Mrs. Wilkins retreated down the path, her head shaking slightly, Evelyn felt the public humiliation creep in. Whispers likely already threading through the block watch meetings, the grocery line, poor Evelyn, losing her grip while Daniel carries the load. By evening, the boys arrived unannounced. Tommy kicking at the gravel with his sneaker, Ben clutching a drawing of a house with a cracked roof. They stood on her doorstep, the main house's lights glowing behind them like a distant beacon. "Dad said you might need company," Tommy mumbled, avoiding her eyes, his 12-year-old frame tense under the weight of adult secrets. Ben thrust the drawing forward, crayon lines smudged. "For you, Grandma. Dad said you're sad." Evelyn knelt, pulling them into a hug, the scent of their shampoo, simple, boyish, grounding her amid the manipulation. Daniel had weaponized them, turning her small act of self-preservation into abandonment, making the children unwitting messengers of guilt. "I'm not sad, sweethearts, just figuring things out. Why don't you tell me about school?" She led them inside, the guest house's warmth enveloping them. But as they ate cookies at her table, sharing stories of recess and homework, she saw the seeds of doubt in their eyes, echoes of their father's narrative, Grandma's changing, pulling away. The real storm broke that night after she'd tucked the boys back in the main house and returned to her solitary supper. The phone rang again, Daniel's voice on the line low and edged with fury, the kitchen clock striking 8 in the background like a gavel. "Mom, this has to stop. Canceling the money? Accusing me in front of the kids? You're making me look like the villain here, when I'm the one keeping this roof over your head." She stood by the sink, the window reflecting her shadowed face, the main house dark now except for his study light. "Daniel, it's not accusations. It's what I've seen. The diner, the fair, Laura's car. I won't enable it anymore." A pause. Then his tone shifted, laced with threat, the words deliberate as a closing door. "You think you can just walk away? That guest house is on my property, paid for with my sweat. I've got lawyers who can make this messy. Eviction papers, claims you're unstable, unfit around the boys. The town's already talking. Clara says you're confused, and the neighbors agree. You'll end up alone, Mom, in some state home, no family left. Sarah hears rumors like this. It could kill her. Is that what you want? Back off, or I'll make sure everyone knows you're the one breaking us." The line went dead, his breath ragged in the silence, before the dial tone returned. Evelyn sank into a chair, the humiliation crashing over her like a wave, the threats of legal entanglement, the smear painting her as mentally frail, the intimidation twisting her love for the boys into leverage. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, mirroring the escalation that had turned her quiet boundary into a battlefield. She reached for the notebook again, her hand steady despite the tremor in her chest, adding the call's details, time, words, the cold precision of his retaliation. The pastor's counsel echoed faintly, boundaries invite pushback, but truth endures, yet in the dim light, alone with the weight of isolation, the neglect she'd witnessed in Sarah's room felt mirrored in her own unraveling world, manipulation's grip tightening like vines around a weakening trellis. The next morning brought more. A visit from Daniel's uncle at the hardware store, stopping by with a toolbox and a lecture on family loyalty, his eyes narrowing as he hinted at her episodes of forgetfulness. Whispers at church midweek prayer group, where women averted their gazes, murmuring about Evelyn's recent troubles. Guilt gnawed at her, threats loomed in every shadow, the smear campaign weaving through kin and community like smoke. She endured it quietly, the boys' hesitant hugs her only solace, but the escalation pressed on, a relentless tide, testing the fragile dam of her resolve. In the hush of the guest house, with rain threatening again on the horizon, Evelyn wondered how much further it would go before the truth broke through. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Evelyn reach more people who still believe in humanity. The days dragged into a fragile truce after Daniel's call, the guest house a sanctuary of sorts, its walls thin but holding against the chill winds that swept through the yard each evening. Evelyn moved through her routines with mechanical care, brewing tea in the mornings, folding laundry in the afternoons. Her notebook now a constant companion on the kitchen table, its pages filling with dates and details, like a map of her unraveling world. The boys came by less often, their visits shortened by Daniel's watchful eye. Tommy's questions about why Grandma's mad met with her gentle deflections, Ben's small hand slipping from hers quicker than before. Sarah's condition worsened. The hospital calls came daily now, her voice a faint thread over the line, asking for Daniel in whispers that Evelyn answered with half-truths, the lies tasting sharper each time. It was on a Thursday afternoon, the sky heavy with unshed rain, that the deeper fracture revealed itself. Evelyn had driven to the hospital alone, the old sedan rattling over potholes on the county road, her mind replaying the pastor's words from their last quiet meeting in the chapel annex. Truth reframes, even when it shatters. Sarah lay in the pale room, monitors beeping a steady rhythm, her frame swallowed by the bed, skin translucent under the fluorescent hum. The window overlooked a parking lot dotted with puddles, reflecting the grey clouds like broken mirrors. Evelyn pulled a chair close, taking her daughter's-in-law hand, cool and weightless, the IV line a lifeline tethering her to the present. "Sarah," she said softly, brushing a strand of thinning hair from her forehead. "How are you feeling today?" Sarah's eyes fluttered open, hazy but searching, a faint smile curving her lips. "Tired, Evelyn. But the boys, tell me about them." Her voice was a rasp, each word an effort, yet she clung to the normalcy, the family law that had sustained her through the fevers and the nights of bone-deep ache. Evelyn squeezed her hand, the chapel's moral boundaries echoing in her chest. Protect, but honor the truth. "They're growing so fast. Tommy's got a science project on bridges, says it'll be as strong as his dad's designs." She paused, the omission heavy. Daniel's absence is a ghost in the room, but Sarah's gaze sharpened, holding hers with an intensity that belied her frailty. "Evelyn," she whispered, her free hand fumbling toward the bedside drawer, "there's something I need you to see." With trembling fingers, she pulled out a small envelope, yellowed at the edges, postmarked from the city 6 months back. It had been tucked away, hidden beneath tissues and a worn Bible, the kind Sarah read from during her stronger hours. "I found it in Daniel's jacket pocket, after one of his late nights. Didn't want to believe it at first." Evelyn took the envelope, her pulse quickening, the paper crisp against her skin. Inside was a letter, typed on firm letterhead from a law office downtown, addressed to Daniel. She unfolded it carefully, the words blurring at first in the room's dim light, then snapping into focus like a revelation in the confessional. It outlined a settlement, debts hidden deep in the firm's accounts, loans Daniel had taken against future projects, gambling on speculative builds that had soured in the market crash last year. Over $100,000 siphoned quietly, masked by inflated expenses and side deals. The lawyers demanded repayment, threatening exposure that could sink Hargrove Designs, the empire he'd built on borrowed ground. But it was the attachment that reframed everything, a draft of a will, Daniel's, revised just weeks after Sarah's diagnosis. It named Laura as beneficiary for a business trust, funneling assets from the firm and the house to her should anything happen to him. Sarah's care, the boy's future, even the guest house, all contingent on his survival, with clauses that diminished Evelyn's role to a footnote, her contributions appreciated but non-binding. No mention of Sarah's inheritance from her own family, the modest savings she'd brought to the marriage, now eroded by treatments Daniel had managed, with minimal input from her. Sarah watched her read, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks, the monitor's beeps accelerating slightly. "He told me the firm was solid, that we were secure, but I overheard him on the phone once arguing about the debts. Then Laura, I saw texts on his phone when he left it charging. She's not just a distraction, Evelyn. She's the way out. For him, the affair, the openness. It's control. He needs me gone to trigger the insurance, to clean the slate without the mess of divorce. And you, your pension, the guest house, it's all utility to him, keeping the home running, the boys quiet, so he can maneuver free. Evelyn's breath caught, the letter trembling in her hands, the pieces slotting into place with a sickening clarity. The late nights weren't just escape, they were planning. Laura complicit in the web, her colleague smiles at family gatherings, a veil over shared secrets. Daniel's reliance on her money hadn't been familial duty. It was extraction, valuing her only as the reliable cog, the widow whose endurance oiled his descent. Clara's dismissals, the neighbours' pity, they weren't misreadings. They were echoes of his narrative, protecting the man who'd prioritized his hidden debts and new life over the vows that bound them. I confronted him once, quietly. Sarah continued, her voice fading, the effort etching lines of pain across her face. He laughed it off, said I was delirious from the meds, too sensitive in my weakness. But now, the boys. Promise me, Evelyn, don't let him take them into that. Evelyn folded the letter, slipping it back into the envelope, her own tears held in check by the steel of newfound truth. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the weight of betrayal's full measure, not just infidelity, but a calculated unraveling where love had been currency, spent on control and escape. Outside, the first raindrops pattered against the window, blurring the lot into abstraction, mirroring the reframing in her soul. Daniel hadn't drifted, he'd orchestrated, using Sarah's illness as cover. Her as the silent financier of his duplicity. The good son, the devoted husband, all facade, valuing them for what they provided. Stability, silence, a stage for his pivot. She leaned forward, pressing the envelope into her purse, her voice steady, despite the quake inside. I promise, Sarah, the truth will protect them. Rest now. As she rose, the hallway's fluorescent buzz greeted her. Nurses murmuring at the station, oblivious to the revelation that had just rewritten her world. Driving home through the downpour, the wipers slashing rhythmically, Evelyn gripped the wheel, the secret motive burning like a coal. Debts, an affair entwined with inheritance grabs, complicity from the woman who'd posed as friend. She was no longer the confused outsider. She was the one who'd been valued only for utility, her loyalty a tool in his design. The rain hammered on, washing nothing clean, but illuminating the path to what came next. Not vengeance, but the quiet exposure of lies that had festered too long in the shadows. The rain had eased to a fine mist by the time Evelyn pulled into the driveway of the guest house. The old sedan's tires hissing softly on the wet gravel. The envelope from Sarah burned in her purse like a hidden ember, its contents reframing every late-night excuse, every check she'd written from her pension. She sat there for a moment, engine idling, the dashboard light casting a greenish glow on her face, illuminating the resolve hardening in her eyes. The main house loomed dark across the yard, Daniel's truck absent, likely at the office or with Laura, plotting the next move in a game she'd only now fully seen. No dramatic storming of doors, no accusations hurled in the night. Justice, she knew from the pastor's steady counsel, came in measured steps, the kind that built on truth rather than spectacle. She killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the drip of water from the eaves, and stepped out into the cooling air. The path to the guest house felt longer tonight, each crunch underfoot a reminder of the boundaries she'd begun to draw. Inside, she flicked on the kitchen light, its bulb humming faintly overhead, and spread the letter and will draft across the table. The notebook waited there, pages dense with her meticulous notes, dates of transfers, sightings of Laura's car, overheard snippets from Daniel's calls. Documentation, Pastor Ellis had emphasized in their last meeting, a quiet armor against denial. She added the new details: the law firm's letterhead, the postmark, Sarah's whispered confirmation. Her hand didn't shake. Instead, it moved with the precision of someone reclaiming stolen ground. The next morning dawned grey and sodden, the mist clinging to the windows like reluctance. Evelyn rose early, brewing coffee in the percolator that had been her husband's, its gurgle a small ritual of continuity. She dressed simply, slacks and a cardigan, practical for the errands ahead, and placed a call to the one ally she'd trusted enough to confide in partially, Mrs. Harlan, Sarah's older sister from across the state line. They'd spoken sparingly over the months, bound by concern for Sarah and the boys, but Evelyn had sensed in her a clarity unclouded by Daniel's charm. "Come over," Mrs. Harlan said after hearing the bare outline, her voice steady over the line, laced with the no-nonsense tone of a retired schoolteacher. "Bring everything. We'll sort this." By noon, Mrs. Harlan arrived, her compact car pulling up with a gravel sputter, rain beading on the windshield. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s, hair pulled back in a sensible bun, carrying a leather satchel that clinked faintly with files. They sat at the kitchen table, the envelope between them like a shared confession, steam from fresh mugs curling in the air. Evelyn recounted it all: the debts, the will, Laura's role, not in fury, but in the flat recitation of facts, her voice even as the mist outside thickened. Mrs. Harlan listened, nodding occasionally, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she scanned the documents. "This isn't just betrayal," she said finally, tapping the will draft. "It's fraud, potentially. The insurance policies Sarah took out years ago, Daniel's the beneficiary, but if he's maneuvering like this—" She trailed off, pulling a notepad from her satchel. "We document more. Copies to a lawyer I know, quiet, no headlines, and Sarah's savings. She mentioned them to me once. Tucked away for the boys. If he's touched that—" Evelyn nodded, the allies' presence a ballast against the isolation that had gripped her for weeks. No grand alliance, just two women piecing together the web. Their conversation punctuated by the rain's patter on the roof. Mrs. Harlan suggested a family lawyer in the next town over, one who handled estates without fanfare, and they made the appointment for the following day. "Start with protecting the boys," she advised, her pen scratching notes. "Guardianship papers in case, and your place here. Get it appraised, see about buying it out or relocating. Boundaries mean options, Evelyn." The lawyer's office was a cramped space above a bookstore. Shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and discretion. Mr. Tate, a wiry man in his 70s with wire-rimmed glasses, reviewed the papers over weak coffee, his desk lamp casting pools of light on the cluttered surface. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the street slick and reflective. "This will's suspicious," he murmured, flipping pages. "Undue influence, perhaps. Tied to the debts. No criminal charges yet, but exposure could force his hand." He outlined steps, letters to the firm's creditors, notifying them of the personal guarantees Daniel had signed, a formal request for financial transparency in the marriage, citing Sarah's health, and crucially, a protective order for Evelyn's assets, severing the informal dependencies that had bound her. "File quietly," he said, handing her copies stamped and sealed. "Consequences follow truth, not threats." Back home that evening, the first decisive boundary took shape. Daniel returned early for once, the truck's headlights cutting through the dusk as Evelyn waited on the porch, the envelope's copies tucked in her sweater pocket. The boys were at a neighbor's for a playdate, the house empty save for the hum of the refrigerator. He stepped out, face set in wary lines, the scent of office coffee clinging to his jacket. "Mom, we need to talk about this nonsense. Clara said you're stirring up trouble. Lawyers? What's gotten into you?" She met his gaze, the porch light soft on her face, no tremor in her stance. "It's not nonsense, Daniel. The debts, the will, Laura, Sarah showed me. I have copies and others know now. No more transfers, no more silence. The guest house lease ends next month. I'll be moving. And the boys, their future isn't yours to gamble away. His eyes widened, the color draining, a flicker of calculation crossing his features before defensiveness settled in. You wouldn't. This family means truth, she cut in. Her voice low, the boundary unyielding as the oak beside them. Leave Sarah in peace. Focus on the boys, or face what's coming. The creditors, the exposure. It's your choice now. He stood there, rain-damp air thickening between them, words failing as the weight of documentation and allies pressed in. No shouts, no collapse, just the quiet unraveling of his control. He turned back to the truck without another word, engine rumbling to life, taillights fading down the drive. Evelyn watched until the road emptied, then stepped inside, locking the door with a click that echoed finality. The consequences unfolded in the days that followed, realistic and inexorable, like seasons turning. Daniel's firm faced audits after the creditors' inquiries. Whispers of mismanagement rippling through town without Evelyn's name attached. Just facts, laid bare in boardroom silences. Laura faded from sight, her business trust dissolving under scrutiny, the affair's openness curdling into isolation as colleagues distanced themselves. He visited Sarah more, the hospital logs noting the shift, his presence a grudging return, born of necessity rather than remorse. The boys stayed with Evelyn most evenings, their questions answered in gentle truths. Daddy's learning, like we all do. No arrests, no public shaming. Just the slow squeeze of accountability, the will contested and revised under legal eyes, Sarah's savings secured for the children. Pastor Ellis met her once more in the chapel, the pews empty under afternoon light, his nod approving as she shared the turns. Justice isn't thunder, he said simply. It's the light that reveals what's hidden. Evelyn felt it then, the quiet restoration, dignity reclaimed not through triumph, but through the steady work of truth. The guest house felt less like a cage now, its walls a temporary bridge to whatever came next, the rain outside, a cleansing rhythm on the roof. Months passed like the slow turning of seasons, the autumn leaves giving way to winter's bare branches. Then the tentative green of spring pushing through the garden soil, Evelyn tended once more. The guest house, with its creaking floors and single-paned windows that fogged in the mornings, had become a place of deliberate quiet, not entrapment. She had moved out by early December, packing her few belongings into boxes labelled in her neat script, linens, books, the boys' drawings pinned to a corkboard she carried like a talisman. The small apartment in town, on the second floor of a brick building overlooking the river, smelled of fresh paint and possibility, its rent covered by her pension and a modest settlement from the estate review. No fanfare attended the shift. Daniel signed the papers in the lawyer's office without protest, his face drawn, eyes averted from the documents that spelled out the end of his leverage. Sarah slipped away in late February, on a morning when snow dusted the hospital windows like a soft veil. Evelyn was there, holding her hand through the final hours, the room filled with the steady beep of monitors slowing to silence. Daniel arrived late, the boys in tow, their small faces pressed against the glass of the waiting room door. He stood at the bedside, words failing him, the weight of exposure and loss etching new lines into his features. The funeral was simple, under a grey sky at the chapel where Evelyn had first confessed, Pastor Ellis presiding with words that honoured endurance over perfection. The town murmured condolences, the earlier whispers of confusion fading into awkward silences. No one pressed for details, the truth's quiet exposure having done its work without spectacle. Evelyn watched from the front pew as the casket lowered, the boys flanking her, Tommy's hand tight in hers, Ben's head resting on her shoulder. Daniel lingered at the edges, his firm contracted now, debts restructured under watchful creditors, Laura a memory packed away like old blueprints. He visited the boys weekly, supervised at first by Mrs. Harlan's steady presence, the interactions strained, but building toward something resembling accountability. No grand reconciliation bloomed. Instead, there were phone calls about school events, transfers for child support that arrived on time, a tentative nod at the grocery where their carts passed in the aisle. Family, Evelyn realized in those moments, wasn't the unyielding knot of blood and obligation she'd once believed, but a choice renewed daily, forged in boundaries, tempered by truth, fragile as the ice on the river come thaw. In the evenings, after tucking the boys into her spare room for overnights, Evelyn sat by the apartment window, the river's murmur a constant companion. The water flowed onward, carving paths through stone over centuries, unhurried and unyielding. She thought often of dignity, how it had slipped from her grasp in the guest house's shadows, traded for the illusion of harmony. It wasn't flashy, that self-respect, no triumphant speeches or courtroom victories, but a quiet reclamation, like pulling weeds from the garden to let new growth breathe. The pastor's counsel had been the seed. Name the manipulation, draw the line, protect without destruction. In following it, she'd unearthed not just Daniel's secrets, but her own capacity for moral courage, the endurance that had sustained her now redirected toward healing. Faith in humanity flickered in small signs, haunting in their subtlety. Mrs. Harlan became a regular at the kitchen table, sharing tea and updates on the boys' progress, her alliance a reminder that compassion could bridge divides without demanding erasure of self. The church community, once quick to misread, offered casseroles and quiet visits, their earlier judgments softened by time and the visible mending. Even Daniel, in rare unguarded moments, admitted the drift. A letter slipped under her door one rainy afternoon, words scrawled in his architect's precise hand. "I lost my way, Mom. For the boys' sake, thank you for not letting me destroy it all." No apology absolved the betrayal, but the acknowledgement lingered, a crack in the facade that let light through, affirming that people, flawed as they were, could turn toward redemption when confronted with unvarnished truth. What family really meant unfolded in these reflections, a haunting tapestry woven from threads of loyalty and loss. It wasn't the grand colonial on Maple Lane, with its pool and promises, nor the dependencies that had bound her like vines. Family was the choice to endure silently no longer, to extend compassion without self-immolation, to redefine bonds around mutual respect rather than utility. Evelyn saw it in the boys' laughter echoing from the riverbank, where they skipped stones on lazy Sundays, free from the weight of unspoken secrets. In Sarah's memory, preserved in a locket she wore, a gentle soul whose quiet grace had mirrored her own. And in the chapel visits, where Pastor Ellis nodded from his vestry, his presence a steady guidepost, reminding her that confessions led not to perfection, but to the profound grace of starting anew. The apartment's single lamp glowed softly one spring evening as Evelyn penned a letter to Clara, the rift mended in halting steps, forgiveness offered, not demanded, boundaries intact. Outside, the river caught the last light, a silver thread winding toward the unseen. Dignity, she mused, was this, the calm after the storm. Faith held not in blind trust, but in the humanity that emerges when illusions shatter. Family, in its truest form, was the circle drawn by those who chose truth over convenience, endurance over erasure. And in that circle she stood whole, the weight of silence lifted, the soul quietly saved. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching The Case of Evelyn. See you in the next one.